Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Doing Business in the U.S., Creating U.S.-Ready Marketing Collateral and Unique Selling Proposition. Before we get started, I'd like to go over a few items so you know how to participate in today's event. You've joined the presentation as a listener using your computer's speaker system by default. If you would prefer to join over the telephone, just select Telephone in the audio pane and the dial-in information will be displayed. You'll have the opportunity to submit text questions for today's presenters by typing into the Questions pane of the control panel. You may send in your questions at any time during the presentation. We'll collect these and address them during the Q&A session at the end of today's presentation. Again, I'd like to welcome everyone to our webinar. My name is Charlotte Andrews, and I am the UKTI Coordinator at Altios International. Today, we're going to address the topic of creating U.S.-ready marketing collateral and unique selling proposition. Whether you're trying to reach prospective buyers, partners, or investors, marketing collateral materials are a must-have for companies of all sizes. They carry your brand, they serve as sales tools, and they offer you the opportunity to deliver your value proposition and competitive differentiators. Due to the highly competitive nature of the U.S. market and cultural differences between the U.S. and the U.K., it's crucial that you create compelling U.S.-specific marketing collateral to effectively reach American audiences. Today, with the help of our expert panelists, we're going to learn more about how to create marketing materials that suit the U.S. market. Today, we'll be joined by Alyssa Dver, founder and CEO of Mint Green Marketing. Then we'll be joined by John Bennett, principal at Alouette Communications. And our final panelist will be Roth, founder of H.A. Roth Consulting. Without further ado, I'm going to pass it over to Alyssa Dver.
Good morning. I should say good afternoon, everyone. It's morning here on the East Coast in the U.S., but I am very excited to be talking with you all today. And Charlotte, this thing is not moving again. There we go. Okay. So just a very brief introduction. I know everyone's going to get handouts of these, and I'm going to go relatively fast today just to give you some high-level tips and some tricks, if you will, about ways to enter the U.S. market. I've been doing this for many years. I was a chief marketing officer for a number of companies, both public and private, some based in Europe, some here in the U.S. And in the last 12 years, I've been a consultant for about 150 companies, many of them coming from Europe as well as South America and a few over in Asia. I also teach marketing all the time. It's something I love to do, so hopefully we're going to have a good time together. As we look at a very simple picture here, for those of you who've been doing marketing, have a marketing education, you're going to go, yeah, but it may be new for some of you, and I think it's a good refresher and a way for us to be very organized today. It doesn't matter what market you're going into, whether it be the U.S., Brazil, China, it doesn't matter. This holds true in every scenario. You need to attract customers or prospects. You need to then engage them in a sales cycle. You need to close the deal and then ideally retain them to not only keep them happy customers, but happy buyers to upsell and repeat sales in that case. And this may seem very obvious, but as we start to go through all these different things that you can do in marketing, it can get very confusing. So we're going to use this almost as a legend today to really kind of keep organized, and hopefully it will help us as we talk through all these great opportunities we can go after together. When companies come to the U.S., one of the things that I find is very overlooked is some of the low-hanging relationships, as we call them, that you might have. And for example, your compatriots. So there are chambers of commerce that for whatever country, it could be the Chamber of Commerce for Ireland, it could be the Chamber of Commerce for England, Britain, and so forth. They have different names. But those are great organizations to plug into. Associations, it could be country-based associations, more likely vertical or industry associations that, again, may have some good connections, easy ways for you to make introductions and meet people here. Consulates, my goodness, UKTI, one of the sponsors here, don't forget to plug into their network. They do business here. They have lots of contacts. Their member organizations are good contacts for you here as well. And they can provide invaluable ways to get started. And of course, agencies like Altios, they have existing customer bases and networks as well. And I find that with companies, again, that are coming to the U.S., these are some of the easiest ways to build that very quick and very meaningful relationships to get into the market here, finding customers, finding partners, and so forth. Another group that is often overlooked, if you will, they're not considered, and I don't really understand why, but it seems so obvious when I say this, I'm sure, is if you have customers in your existing homeland or other countries, perhaps they have U.S. subsidiaries, and those should be, no-brainers. Ask for an introduction. And at the same time, ask your existing customers and partners if they have U.S.-based contacts that might be interested in the product or service that you're offering. And this is all, again, maybe very obvious to some of you, but I will tell you in at least 150 case studies, it's often overlooked because there's so many other things that are going on to enter the U.S. that people forget that you have this built-in network behind you. But once those contacts are kind of gone through and people often say, I need more than that, okay, great. The one thing that I'm sure you also know is the U.S. is a huge market. And trying to sell to everybody is just not practical. It's not going to work. You're going to spend a lot of time and, more importantly, a ton of money and not get results. So the proverbial idea of picking a beachhead. And a beachhead can be a vertical niche if you have one. It can be a particular job title if you're selling B2B. It can be, when I say existing clients, say your existing client base has particular types of demographics that are relatively common. But you need to pick something. And I think that this is the hardest thing for entrepreneurs in particular. It's hard for CEOs of any size company because they say, I don't want to miss opportunities. Well, here's the reality. If you don't pick something, you're not going to get any opportunities, or more likely will get no opportunities because, again, you can't market to everybody in any size market, let alone one the size of the U.S. So let me give you some examples of a beachhead. So inevitably, we have customers or clients that say, I want to come to the U.S. and my client base are, say, high-end financial institutions, or we market to IT developers that are using particular tools. Great. That's fabulous. If you have that kind of market niche already identified, that beachhead, fabulous. But it's really important to come over and do some research. Don't assume that a developer in the UK is the same kind of person, or I should say the same kind of buyer in the US. They have different processes, they may have different needs, they may have different technical requirements, and so forth. Consumer buyers, of course, are going to be different. They have different ways that they get educated in the market. They may have different ways that they purchase and prefer to purchase. So there are going to be differences, and sometimes the most subtle differences are the most important. So how do you understand those differences? Now, of course, you can spend years and millions of dollars doing formal market research, but there's some very easy ways to really get at what market that you need to go after and what are the things that they really care about. And this builds up to your unique selling proposition, which I know my colleagues are going to be talking in detail later on. So this is really the kind of the foundation, the grassroots of what you need to do to build the USP. So primary research, this means talking directly to the market. And whether you do it or you hire a consultant to do it, getting in front of that target market and asking them questions, asking them what kind of products are they using today, what kind of technology requirements, how do they buy whatever product or service that you're selling. If they're buying it on the internet, how are they looking for it? Are they Googling it? Are they getting referrals? Do they use testimonies? Do they go to a demo? You've got to ask those kinds of questions to really understand how they're finding their product and their information, as well as what their buying cycle is. So primary information, interviewing them. There are very simple ways to go out and recruit people in that target market, whether you do it through social media, you can do it through hiring a company to go out and actually set up those appointments. There's a number of ways to do it, but talking directly with the horses. And literally, if you can get in front of them physically, looking at them, that's the best. If you have to do it on the phone or on Skype, on a Hangout, okay. If you have to do it in email, okay. But the more that you can really see and talk to those people, the better, and ask those questions. There's also a good amount of secondary research that I think is really, really helpful. Again, not spending a year and a day, but going and reading and seeing what's happening in the market, whether it's from the media, analyst reports, if there's analysts in your particular industry, thought leaders, bloggers. Some of the thought leader bloggers in your industry really have a pulse of what's going on as well. And then I always recommend, and people kind of get nervous when I say competitive, you know, I have to say that anyone who doesn't think they have competition, that's not correct. You always have competition. Maybe for your particular kind of product or service, you do it a little bit differently, but there isn't money sitting in prospects' budgets waiting for you to show up. So your competition is always something that's competing for those same dollars. And so going in and understanding how your product or service competes is very important. You know, what are the features and benefits that are different? But also, how are they marketing? Are they spending a ton of money going to trade shows? What kind of PR press? Are they using social media? Those are ways that you can get very smart about the type of marketing and the amount of marketing that you might have to do just by studying your competition. Online forums and social media. I know a lot of people think LinkedIn groups stink. Not all of them stink. Not all of the online forums stink. There are particular groups, like, so for example, associations have forums and so forth. They're really, really valuable places to hear and see what the latest issues are and what people are really concerned about. So all that can provide you with some great research. Here's an example, and I'm going to go quickly through these examples. They're case studies, but here's a company actually based in the U.S. They offer language services. The language services are not translation. They're things like accent reduction, cultural awareness. This was their website before they talked to the horses, if you will, before they did that primary research. And in doing so, they realized that in their customer base, they had a lot of industry aggregation. So we redid their website. We kind of not only cleaned it up and made it much simpler, and I'm going to give you some tips in just a minute about how to make really clean and beautiful US-based websites. But you'll see on the left we added tabs for industry-specific. And when you blow out that tab, you see the 3 different industries that they're going after: manufacturing, hospitals, and food. The beauty of doing something like this, though, is now they have a landing page. And when they have a salesperson go after hospital healthcare, they can send the person here. The messaging is very specific to that hospital and healthcare. And one of the things we learned in that interview is that hospitals are very concerned when a doctor or a nurse has a heavy accent, because they're talking to the family or the patient, and the patient may not understand what that doctor or nurse is saying. That's a real liability. So that became a real key issue that we really hit hard on this website. And again, when they're talking to a hospital or healthcare environment, they can direct the person right here to read up, download the white paper, and so forth. It makes a huge positive impact. The proof of that is a $4 million contract popped up 90 days after the site went live. So needless to say, I'm a big believer in segmentation. Now that we kind of know who we're going to go after, let's assume that we've picked this segment. How do we get those people? And there's 3 different aspects of marketing I want to touch on very lightly here. One is foundational marketing. There's certain things that you have to do in your marketing. And those things include building a website. You have to have basic SEO, search engine optimization, because people have to be able to find you. Does that mean you have to go crazy advanced at this point? Maybe, depending on your product, but not necessarily. But you have to have some basic concept in there. A one-page or data sheet, brochure, something that you can email, something that people can download, very, very important, particularly if you're going to go to events and you want to have something in print. Case studies and testimonials, more important than anything else you can put on your website, in my opinion. And videos, anything you can do in a video format will not only get more viewership, but it has more credibility. People will believe a video before they believe anything they read. You need a presentation. I don't care if you're B2B or B2C. B2B and B2C, you're going to wind up talking about your product or service maybe with some investors, with other people that are involved, stakeholders. You need a presentation. It doesn't have to be long, typically 8 pages, 8 slides is plenty. And then, of course, if you have a product that requires a demo, it's really, really helpful. An explainer video, for example, is something that people do instead of a demo. Very helpful. And then last but certainly not least on the list is you have to start building a contact database, at least have a way to organize those contacts back from the compatriots list that you've compiled perhaps, as well as any list that you go forward. And once you have those things in place, and it can be very quick to get them, you may already have them, now you can do what we call push marketing, really getting the message, really getting the offer out to the market. And one way to do that, people do buy lists, email lists. I personally am not a big fan of email because I think the response rate is very low. I think with spam and all the other caveats, it's very challenging to get email out there. But people still do use email, and they buy lists. Again, you have to be careful who you're buying from. But as you start to build your contact list from maybe people who visit your website, you go to trade shows and other things, you've got to have that database in place so you can follow up and keep track of those leads. You want to always have call to actions, have people, when you send an email, you have them on your website, here, go here, download this white paper, and so forth. And that really starts the engagement process. That really gets you out of acquisition mode right into selling and engagement. All these other techniques, social selling, very powerful. I actually work with a partner in Ireland, and we do some really incredible social selling campaigns. That's a technique to use LinkedIn in particular as a way of engaging and acquiring and engaging people. Trade shows, of course, is a way of getting new names and so on. You can read the list here. Advertising, again, online and offline advertising, and there are other techniques. But these are ways that you're basically going into the market and saying, hey, I've got something here to offer you. In terms of pulling them then in, that's where your content gets really robust. It gets really important to have good content, and you can post that in any one of these kinds of things. This webinar, we've already acquired you. You know who Altios is, and now we're engaging you in a webinar. So those are ways that you can start to really qualify and have conversations with your prospects. And again, some of this is very B2B oriented, but B2C these days is starting to look like B2B and vice versa. So they're really, really blending, and I invite you to kind of use these as checklists to think about what would be helpful for your particular product or service. In a case study example, very quickly, this is a company that sells global trade software. This is their blog. It was started in 2008. We actually did it originally. They have over 150,000 followers. It's a content-rich of driving traffic to their site, to their organization. But you'll notice here that the content is not salesy. It's not about their product. It's really about the news in the industry. It provides a huge value to them. So it's really, really, really great content that's bringing in people and bringing in leads for them. Their company, by the way, grew from a $5 million company to now they're well over a $100 million company. Largely, they say, attributed to marketing, and particularly that blog did a great job for them. I want to do some quick do's and don'ts on collateral and then some quick do's and don'ts on websites, and hopefully these are things that will help you kind of just have filters as you start to build some of your own collateral and websites. You have to be very clear. The U.S. market, and I'm presenting to you almost in U.S. mode intentionally. I'm going fast because particularly in the U.S., if you're selling on either one of the coasts, we move fast. There's not a lot of patience. They don't want to hear about a lot of fluff, if you will. They want to know the guts. What do you got? How can it help me? And so collateral, this is an example of a French company that had a very complex product, but I thought it was a good example. Look how simple that looks. You see there's the logos on the bottom. That's their testimony. You see a little bit about their product. On the back side of it, you see it's equally simple. It gives a little bit more technical information. But that's the kind of collateral that people will grab and read quickly and then say, give me more information. Your collateral doesn't necessarily and shouldn't try and answer everything. The same thing with your website. Your website's not meant to be the end-all, be-all. You want your website to give enough information that people call, email, or tweet you, whatever it is, to get more information. A good basic website, this is not for a company that's been in business for a while or mid-sized company, but a good website that will give enough information, think between 8 and 10 pages, under 100 words per page. Anything more than that, your readership is not going to stay on the site. They're going to go away, and you don't want them to do that. So here are some of the pages that are typical, graphics and video. Absolutely have to have a .com URL, not a .uk or .anything else. .com is very important in the U.S. People will not think of you as a U.S.-based or global company unless you have that. And make sure that you're checking through all your different aspects to make sure that it's in American English. When I do this for the French, for example, or any other country that's not native English, it's a different issue per se. But as you probably know, American English looks like typos to anyone who speaks British English and vice versa. There's a lot of words that are not consistent, that we don't use, and we spell differently. So make sure you have somebody who really goes through that carefully. And in fact, you might have a unique U.S. site. That's very common that there's a site that's specific for the U.S. So do's and don'ts. U.S. people, again, very short on patience. We don't want to hear about the company history details when you moved into your new office. That's very nice, but it's not necessary on a website. The mission, objectives, and values, that kind of went out in the 80s. It was big back in the day of Michael Porter, but it's not anymore. So needless to say, don't feel obligated to put a lot on there. You could put a sentence or two, but not a whole long litany of things. And then very important, you want to make it personal. And I know this is a little bit awkward for a lot of people who are not American. As much as I said we want to know quick and dirty, yes, we want to know the key elements, but we also want to know who you are. And so here's a quick example. I'm going to skip this one because of time, but here's a quick example of a website, and this is also actually a U.S. website. This is a business that sells executive coaching, and they sell both to B2B and B2C market. And this was their old website. Of course, you're looking at that going, ew, what an eyesore. Here's what their new website looked like. They actually embedded their blog in there, which is not a bad idea. You see, again, the logos on the bottom showing the proof of who they are. But here is really the important thing. Here's where they came from in terms of their Our Team page, and here's where they ended up. Something that was a lot friendlier and welcoming, and even down to the individual level. And so I want to invite you to understand how important that having that personal touch and really being part of the culture and being almost vulnerable really does help your marketing here. So of course I'm going to, these slides and some of the other case studies that are in here, I invite you to look at and ask any and all questions. But Charlotte and team, I'm going to pass it over now to John.
Thank you so much, Alyssa. Our next presenter is John Bennett. John, I'm going to pass it over to you.
Thank you very much. Very nice to speak with everyone this morning. Alyssa, thank you for your very interesting and informative presentation as well. Just to give you a little background about myself, I'm from Newburgh, New York, which is in the Hudson Valley of upstate New York. And I attended Georgetown University, where I spent my junior year in France, in Nice, which was a wonderful place to spend one's junior year, but also a very good place to learn about different cultures, American culture and French culture in that case. And so that led me on to Berlitz Languages, which started out as an American company and had American and then British and then Japanese owners. And it's one of the largest language companies with some 500 language centers in 50 countries around the world. And after the Japanese purchased Berlitz, it was a very interesting sort of case study in having a very successful brand, very old and reputable brand, having a very effective and good product, very high quality language instruction, but how the message and how the market was addressed in two different countries were very different. And I think this is a really good lesson for anyone who's looking to come into the U.S. market. You undoubtedly have a very good product or service that you're offering, otherwise you wouldn't be taking the step of looking into expanding into another market, into the U.S. market. But how do you present that? And this is where how you communicate is really quite critical. When the idea of proposing some of the kinds of imagery that was used by Berlitz in Japan in the United States didn't always take into account the American market. So to give you an example of sort of the homework that you need to do, in Japan, English was 90% of the business there. Japanese students or corporate executives really need English both for business and social mobility. Whereas in the United States, English was only about 30% of the market, and all of the other languages made up the majority of instruction. And why do Americans learn another language? Well, in a business meeting, English is probably going to be the language that's used, but it certainly can help in terms of the social side of business communications, and certainly it can be used for travelers who want to make more out of their trip. So the underlying principle of why people were coming to Berlitz, why they were taking language instruction, was quite different. One was a real necessity, and the other was an add-on, an extra. The other differential in the market was that in Japan, because of the idea of saving face, one doesn't want to admit that one needs help with their English. So the executive would go to his or her boss and say, I need help with my English language skills. And they would come to the Berlitz School in Japan, paying for the lessons on their own, let us say. But really, they were getting a subsidy from their employer. In the U.S., the corporate entity contracts for language instruction and therefore negotiates corporate-wide rates, and it's not considered a shame. As a matter of fact, it's for we Americans, I would imagine also some of our British friends, learning and speaking another language is quite unusual. So the Americans certainly had no compunction about requesting help with learning another language. However, what this meant was that the perception of the corporate versus the private was a little bit confused. And so therefore the value of those corporate relationships were not given the priority that they should be in the American market. And finally, the last example of different perceptions of a product or service. In Japan, luxury products are very highly valued. Because language instruction is so important, there were luxury segments, and Berlitz was considered a luxury way of learning a language in Japan. Where in the United States, the idea of effectiveness, speed, these are things, and value for money, these are things that are really critical. So by promoting this idea of a premium brand, it actually worked to the detriment of the U.S. market, because the U.S. market was looking for effectiveness and good value for money. So that's just a little story about how you could have a very good product and it could be very successful, but by trying to promote that product in another culture without taking into account the different cultural expectations could make it that much more difficult for you to get started in your business here in the United States. So after my stint with Berlitz, I founded Maya Press with French partners and became independent as Alouette. And we try to bring this cultural experience and cultural sensitivity to companies that are looking to do business here in the U.S. Or abroad. So taking a look at the English and the British, the quote, the English and the Americans are two peoples divided by a common language, which could be attributed to George Bernard Shaw or Oscar Wilde, holds true in many more ways than just language. One of the things that we found surprising was that the highest percentage of expatriate failures were between the U.S. and the United Kingdom. And why do you suppose it was like that? Well, if you're going to China or if you're going to Saudi Arabia, you expect that the culture, the language, the food, everything is going to be very, very different and very unfamiliar. And so with those kind of expectations, you attempt to take some cultural training, some language training, but you're really expecting this difference. Unfortunately, we don't expect that same difference going from one side of the pond to the other. And so that explains this high failure rate, because the cultural differences, more than really the language, are what informs our behavior and therefore what it informs the way we need to communicate. In the UK, there's a very self-deprecating, dry, witty sense of humor. In the U.S., we feel we have to sort of blow our own horn, as you might say, because the thinking goes, if we're not promoting ourselves, well, then who's going to do it for us? So this is a very different approach. in terms of ads and commercials and promotional material, in the UK, this sort of soft sell, it's subtle, it's entertaining, it's not invasive. This is what is very effective. However, in the US, we're much more used to this sort of hard sell approach. We want information, we want demos, we want comparisons, we have winners. Think of, for example, a paper towel ad where you have two spots of water on the table, and one absorbs all of the water very quickly and is the winner, and the other one doesn't do so well. So we're very comfortable with those kind of comparisons, which may be a little less subtle. They are much more direct, but it's something to keep in mind in terms of creating materials for the U.S. market. Again, wordy paragraphs versus very snappy, short slogans. Think about it. Where was Twitter founded? It started here. The other thing to keep in mind is that the U.S. has a very segmented demographics in just the sheer size of the geography and all of the other aspects are very much more different, let's say, and less homogeneous than they might be in the UK. So if we're marketing to New Yorkers, it may be quite different than marketing to someone in the South or in the Midwest or even in the West Coast. There's also the class differences, which they exist here, even though we don't like to talk about them and pretend that they aren't here. And if you look at a very successful use of sort of class striving, or would be Ralph Lauren, who's trying to replicate the sort of country squire look in his lifestyle products. So it, again, can be used very effectively if it's for the right product or the right demographic. Let's see. Oh, so I'd like to just take a little look at two clients that we worked with. One is the Fashion Footwear Association of New York, and they bring some 800 shoe manufacturers, brands, to 4 trade shows a year held here in New York City. And so they're attracting buyers from department stores, boutiques, various different outlets across the United States, and they're bringing manufacturers, both U.S. manufacturers as well as European and other manufacturers to the market. And so these are the covers that we started with, and if you look, you'll see that they're very direct. They have key points of information, the location, the days, the times, the place, very, very direct. And from these initial directories, which of course the cover, creating the cover is the fun part. The difficult part is getting all of the information about all of the exhibitors correct inside the directory. But again, this is an example of a very direct sort of a marketing approach. From the paper version, we were able to also, with our partners, create an iPad version and an iPhone version because while paper is certainly not dead, there's a place for paper. We're seeing more and more iPhone, iPad, and app sorts of applications being really important, especially here as more and more information we get from our handheld devices as opposed to sitting in front of a computer. So this was an important evolution in this process. The directories led to ads. So we create magazine ads which reflect the same imagery so that there is a consistency across the various channels of getting the word out. And so we create magazine ads for trade magazines within the footwear industry. Then we also do web banners, again, creating the same feel, the same look throughout on the magazine's websites. And e-newsletters, I would say that the e-newsletters, as Alyssa mentioned, if it's a purchase list, it may not be that effective. If it is a list that you've actually met the people at a networking event or that are part of an industry that's interested in this specific field, then I think the e-newsletters can be rather effective. Again, some of the things, a prominent logo, keeping to the key information versus long paragraphs, text being about 60% versus images, and sometimes images don't download, active hyperlinks, and of course tracking of opens and clicks and response rates. All of that are very important in creating effective e-newsletters. And then some other collateral, invitations, postcards, and so forth. Finally, taking a look at EverPower, which is another client and which is part of Terra Firma, an English-based investment firm, we produce some videos, and these are interesting because here we're appealing to a very different demographic. To landowners, typically in Pennsylvania, upper New York State, outside in the Midwest, outside of Chicago. And so you're looking to appeal to farmers, you're looking to appeal to landowners who will lease their land for wind farm development. So quite different from the footwear industry. So again, getting to know how to talk to your potential customer, and certainly video is becoming more and more effective and more in demand. In addition, for EverPower, we prepared corporate social responsibility reports and annual reports talking about the growth of the company, which now is the 18th largest wind producer in the United States. So just to show you that depending upon the target audience, depending upon the product, the marketing materials, the collateral, the videos, all of those really need to be thought about in terms of who you're trying to reach and what the message is, and making that message consistent across all, excuse me, all platforms. So with that, I think we'll pass it on to Hayes.
Thank you so much, John. Our last panelist today will be Hayes Roth.
Hopefully that echo doesn't continue. Thank you very much. This is Hayes, and I'm now in control of the mic. Thank you very much, guys, and I'm going to try to breeze through this because much of what I was starting off with has been covered far better with our previous speakers. But just to touch on my own background, I have been in the business for a very long time in terms of marketing communications. Started in advertising, did my own marketing consulting firm back in the 80s and 90s, and for most of the past 20 years I've been at a company called Landor, which we're going to talk about in some depth in a few minutes. Past 12 of those was both creating and then ultimately serving as their chief marketing officer on managing the Landor brand really around the globe, as well as being a senior lead on a number of B2B and nonprofit branding projects. Now I'm back in my own business since last summer, doing many of the same kinds of things, only on a somewhat smaller scale, working for smaller audiences. And I'm getting some static in my headphones. I don't know if that's something that everybody else is hearing as well. I hope not. This is just wow. Charlotte, is anybody else hearing this? Charlotte,
Yes.
I'm getting a lot of static.
Yes.
Yeah, there's a lot of static. Is that just me, or are all of you hearing it?
Oh, no, it's fine. You can go ahead. Oh, no, it's fine. You can go ahead.
All right, good. Sorry about that. So looking at my own background, again, not to belabor this, but these are a number of the clients that I've worked on. Many of these are both B2B and B2C. There's quite a crossover in that. I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about the rules of B2C and B2B because the previous speakers, Alyssa in particular, spent a lot of time talking about this. I think the rules are pretty straightforward there. So I'm going to move on to some of the differences in talking about B2B. And these are fairly general, but I think they might be worth noting. Clearly in the consumer world, we tend to talk to very large multiple target groups that you've just heard from both John and Alyssa. In the United States, this is a very broad, highly demographically diverse country, and so it really does require a great deal of thought in terms of how you go after multiple target groups. That often results in some fairly simplistic messaging unless you really segment in. It's an expensive proposition to go to most consumer audiences in this country, and one of the ways many organizations are getting around that is through increasing use of social media. The virtues of B2B, of course, you have very generally smaller and more tightly targeted markets, and very often these are in the tens of thousands as opposed to even the hundreds of thousands. It's a high-end purchase decision usually, and very often a features-driven messaging situation where you have, very often as we've just seen, some very technical details that have to be communicated. And these communications are often directed at third parties as opposed to the end user. And in my opinion, and you're generally talking to a very informed and sophisticated customer base, they may not be sophisticated marketers, but they certainly know their own product well, and therefore your pitch has to be fairly sophisticated and very knowledgeable in whatever area you're trying to go after. The brand building tools are similar in B2B versus the U.S. Again, we've just talked about these in greater depth than I'm showing here, so I'm not going to belabor this other than one of the things that was not discussed much and which I'm a huge believer in, and you will see in the case study that I'm about to present, I believe that public relations is an essential tool to any successful marketing exercise, probably anywhere, but certainly in the U.S. And I'll show you how we did that for Landor, which is my topic of the day. The first point to be made is that most of you probably never heard about Landor, and we are, and I'm going to just give you a little bit of background. It is one of the leading brand strategy and design firms in the world. It's a very small universe of companies that do that. There are probably only 5 or 6, 7 maybe that actually do the kind of work that Landor does, which is create global brands. If you've seen a FedEx truck or a BP truck or station or anything related to BP, a Smirnoff bottle or Cathay Pacific logo, Landor did it. And it's a company that does work all over the world. We have a 75-year history. It was started by German immigrants, so it wasn't who landed in San Francisco. There are about 750 employees, 24 offices, 19 countries, and we are a division of WPP, which, as most of you may know, is one of the largest marketing communications conglomerates based in the UK. And in fact, the CEO and her staff, senior staff, are Brits and located in London. So it is a very international organization, and we have to appeal across all kinds of geographies and people. Our target audience, however, was, when I was there, a very select group of people. It's CEOs, CMOs, corporate communications directors, and really senior marketing and branding executives of Fortune 1000 companies. A typical sale, if you will, for a Landor project, which would be a consulting project very often resulting in design work of some kind, is $200,000 to $300,000 plus. And many times if you're rebranding an airline or something, a major corporation, it's going to run into the multiple millions. So it's a very considered purchase. It's also a purchase that most clients don't even think about until they actually need it, and it's usually some kind of a sea change experience, such as an M&A activity of some kind, or maybe a new CEO or CMO that wants to make a significant change in the company. So it's not something that you can just knock on doors and say, how about a new logo? It really does require them to be aware of a company like Landor when they are in need of its kind of services. Those kind of companies we would talk to besides the Fortune 1000s, of course, are a lot of nonprofits and industry thought leaders. We also would deal with our own WPP partners who have other agencies. So we, again, had to make sure that we were out there seen as a superior brand, being at the forefront of our industry. The services we provided are listed here: brand assessment, positioning, corporate naming, corporate and product design, brand experience design, and then internal brand actions and engagement. All of these, again, fairly expensive services that are targeted to a very high-end customer. The tools of choice: we had a very rich client base. Some 15-plus years was in our database that we began back before really anyone else had thought to do this in our industry, to our knowledge. And it built to about 16,000 people by the time I left last year. Landor.com, a major window of opportunity for us. It is our core selling proposition, and it is the place we go and we invite our customers to go to make sure that they understand what Landor does. Thought leadership is exceedingly important. Again, this is the way that a company like Landor is able to communicate to its high-end audience that they are at the forefront of thinking in the branding industry, which is very important. That does include collateral and published articles and white papers, plus a lot of online thinking and actions. Public relations, I mentioned earlier, and then, of course, conferences and speaking engagements and social media. I'll just take you through what some of these look like. The website itself was designed about 3 or 4 years ago to be highly interactive, and we made the decision at the time that we were going to make it really almost a magazine of sorts, and that every month it gets updated. This happens to be the one, I think, for February. It is refreshed with a new story. There's always a theme. In this case, the future of packaging is the theme. There will be case studies. If you look across here, these would rotate so that there would be new stories and case studies that relate to the future of packaging, probably a story about a new kind of innovative packaging, maybe a white paper, things that relate to the overarching theme. And then if one goes to any one of these, they're all very live. And so you can touch on a case study here or reach a Landor person here. The point of all this is that it's meant to be a window into what Landor thinks and how it works and what we have to offer. And we were concerned about getting traffic to this because, as we know, unless you have some kind of a hook, it's very difficult to get people to come and find you. So we hit upon the idea of doing a monthly outreach piece, which is we call it there. It was called On Deck, and I know Alyssa commented that newsletters and emails probably are not so effective anymore, and we were cautious about that. But in this case, they're nicely designed. I thought there was an example in here, but it doesn't seem to be here. Very nicely designed. They go out to all 16,000 of the people in the database. It speaks to whatever the theme of the month is. It's very graphically interesting. It's not long. It lists 3 or 4 different items that are going to be featured on the website in a given month. You click on any one of them, it leads you right to one of these sections. If you click on a packaging story, it would take you right to the story, but of course you're now in the website. We noticed when we started doing this a significant bump in web traffic every time we sent one of these out at the beginning of the month, and that, to my knowledge, continues to this day. It turned out to be a very good exercise, and people were able to opt out if they wanted, but very few did, and people actually enjoyed being a part of it. We also did get involved in collateral. About 10 years ago, we produced a massive book, a hardcover edition of the Landor history, plus our featured client stories at the time. We did it in 8 languages, 3 different editions. It was a monumental undertaking. It took over a year to produce this thing, and not a few gray hairs, at the cost of about $750,000. And at the time we did that, we said we'll probably never do this again, and that turned out to be true. That's more than the entire budget that Landor uses for its marketing these days. So those were nice days, but then along came 2008, and we had to get much smarter about how we spent our money. So in the process of doing that, we decided that intellectual capital was really important. So these are examples of articles that we started to produce on the right here that are oriented towards specific topics. One is about brand purpose, the other is about launching a brand and lessons to be learned from that. These were placed in this case, they went in a pay-to-play publication, which is a very common thing to do, that was targeted towards marketers. The important thing isn't how many people actually see your article in a particular publication, because the odds are that it'll be very few or relatively few. What's important is what you do with those stories. So we would republish them, put them on Landor.com, feature them in the send out on deck, and then we'd of course send them out selectively to individual clients who we thought would have interest in them. And so they were heavily merchandised. Perspectives was an idea that one of my team came up with in about 10 years ago. And it's a compendium that is produced annually that collects every bit of all of the best articles and white papers that Landor employees around the world have put together. And it's sent out about this time every year. This is the one from last year. There should be a new one coming out soon. It's now done in iBook format because we know the importance of doing those things digitally, and it gets a lot of great downloads. But there's also the thunk value, we call it, of having a 70, 80-page document that you can send physically to clients and prospects, or put in the room when you walk in, or if you're in a pitch, have it sitting on the desk as the client walks in. And this gets a lot of great response from people, and it's been a very successful piece for Landor for the last number of years. It isn't really collateral. It's not a selling piece. It's a thought piece. And we also do the occasional, what we call a Slim Jim, a fact sheet, which I know Alyssa referenced. These are necessary in terms of just here's what's going on now, but we don't invest, or Landor didn't at the time, invest a great deal of money in that, because that's what the website is supposed to do. Moving forward, public relations I've talked about. These are just examples. This is some old stuff that I did, but the point of this is that we hired a professional brand public relations firm. I didn't try to do this as a trade-out. To me, it was important that we had the best of class thinking, and we tried to make sure that we had a broad spectrum of people from Landor featured as either being interviewed or commenting on things, or sometimes publishing articles, so that Landor's intellectual horsepower was at the forefront. And of course we would always try to get these into verticals, but they could be, it didn't really matter, again, because of the idea of repurposing whatever we did. Conferences and speaking engagements are also extremely important. For a number of years we co-sponsored a marketing conference, a 2-day marketing conference with The Economist. We did this because alignment with that brand was very important. It was international. It was a consumer and corporately oriented business-to-business publication, as you know. It had many of the same attributes of high intellectual capacity and thought-provoking articles that we wanted to communicate as our own brand. And this worked very well. It was very expensive. Ultimately, it became, they chose not to do it anymore, but it was an opportunity for us to have great speakers who we would merchandise and also get to know and work with, not to mention all the clients and the schmooze opportunity. Conferences are a terrific way to do that. Again, it's what you did with them. We would always write a paper on who was there and what they said so that we could send that out and try to leverage all of the contacts and the information there. And then, of course, we try to take an opportunity at every occasion to speak wherever possible, and I'm clearly doing that to this day because here I am. Lastly, social media. We do use a LinkedIn page. There's a Facebook page for Landor, but the LinkedIn page is really for Landor alumni, which is a very fruitful group of people who are off doing, many of them are clients now or prospects, and so we decided a couple of years ago that it would be good to mine them and give them a place on Facebook, or rather on LinkedIn, where they could collect and share information. And we obviously Landor feeds in what's going on the web page, as you'll see here, but there's a great deal of conversation that goes on back and forth, and I have a feeling it results in business. And there's also blogging and tweeting of all the articles and things that it produces. So that, in a nutshell, is a very simplistic approach to how Landor does this. If you actually want to read more about what Landor does, there's an article that I wrote that goes into a great deal of depth that you can get to on my website. What do we learn from all this? You can do a lot with small dedicated teams and not a lot of budget if you're very focused on clearly defined objectives and audiences, as you've heard earlier. It does require active involvement of whoever is on the ground where you're doing the marketing. You can't just run this from a central location remotely, because you must be able to both hear what's going on in the rest of the world and feed them information as it relates to them. And so we spent a lot of time back in the day in Landor. I assume they still do. Once or twice a week, or once every 2 weeks, excuse me, we would have a global call with all the marketing people around the world to make sure that we're all on the same page and tracking new business initiatives, etc. Your CEO must be fully engaged behind any successful marketing plan, and that's certainly going to be true in the U.S. The clients want to see senior leadership involved in whatever project or on a professional services type of organization or service. They want to see the CEO involved. Social media has become a major tool, highly efficient. It's the only way that Landor was able to increase its visibility with reduced budgets, quite honestly. And collateral and brochure material is still used and needed in print form, but it has to be done selectively. It's expensive to do, and it has important but limited application amongst today's customers. I don't think most of them want to be inundated with print materials. Most of it gets thrown away. But if it's the right story to the right person, then it matters. And that is the end of my story. Turning it over.
Thank you, Hayes, for your presentation. We're now going to begin answering the questions submitted during today's presentation. As a reminder, you can still submit questions through the questions pane in your attendee control panel. So I'm going to pass it over to Alyssa with the first question. Can you explain more what social selling is and how it differentiates from social media? Alyssa, have we got you there?
There we go. I couldn't get it on mute. Sorry about that.
No problem.
All right.
So can you explain more what social selling is?
Absolutely. Well, and forgive me, I want to just make a clarification because Hayes made a really good point. When you have a really good database, an opt-in database, your own opt-in database in particular, that people have signed up on your website or have met you at a trade show, whatever it might be, and you know that they're interested in your product or service, newsletters, emails can be very effective. And I say that again, the response rate may be somewhat skewed because, again, spam and all kinds of challenges getting email delivered and read still exists. But when you have a database, it's a different story. Unfortunately, to buy a database of people who never heard of you or just send out random emails, of course, that's just not the way to go. But yet so many companies continue to do that. And I know it's tempting when you get an email from some list broker saying, I have this great list of all these people that you want to talk to. I don't want everyone to walk away being skeptical, but again, I think there's better ways. And in fact, social selling, as I mentioned in the beginning, is a really interesting technique. Social selling basically is really utilizing social media in a way to reach out to prospects. Now, I have a feeling all of you, at least anyone who has a LinkedIn account, has received a message that sounds something like this. You know, we're members of the same group, and I thought I'd reach out and connect with you, interested in just becoming friends or something like that. And that's kind of how it starts. There is some kind of a connection that is a, quote, legal connection by LinkedIn rules. You have a common group, or maybe you have a common person that you know, and you find ways to connect with those people, and particularly people that match your criteria for your vertical segmentation. Once you have that connection, then you can utilize additional messaging, direct messaging to that person, just like you would do a regular old in-person sales call kind of thing. Hey, I'd like to share this with you. Here's a white paper. Here's this article. As Hayes just said, once you get a PR placement, in this day and age, it almost doesn't matter. Of course, if it comes from a major newspaper like the New York Times, people are going to be, ooh, they're going to be very impressed. But even a smaller online publication, if it's good content and you send that to your prospects, again, it's a good technique, and you can do that using LinkedIn. Hey, I thought you'd be interested in this. Here's the link to the article. So you start to build those relationships, and there is a technique. There actually is a process. Some of it can be automated using software, and subsequently you can use LinkedIn. Again, that's much more of a B2B kind of play. You can do similar things using Facebook. I've never seen yet an automated piece because Facebook's a little bit more complex in terms of how it manages messaging. But again, the social media connections can be some really interesting ways to reach prospects. It's not going to be as mass-oriented, say, as your email typically. You can have a database of 5,000 emails and blast something out, but again, in this day and age, with the amount of email, the amount of communications, the amount of noise, particularly in the U.S. market, that doesn't work nearly as well as having something that's really targeted and that you really provide value to that person on the other end with good content. So that is the fundamental difference between social selling and email marketing.
Thank you so much for that, Alyssa. Okay, now we have a question for John. You there, John? Okay. As a startup company, how did you develop your client base?
So it's quite interesting because having had experience working for a 130-year-old brand, Berlitz, to start out a small company with really no name recognition, and I would imagine that in the case of some of our listeners who are working with companies that are perhaps well known in the UK but not so well known in the US, it's a similar issue. So I think going back to a lot of the network that is available to you that Alyssa mentioned earlier in her slide about the consulates, the chambers of commerce, the affinity groups, I think is a really good way to get started. We were members of the French-American Chamber of Commerce. We attended the British-American Business Council, which is very active here in New York. And this really helped get things off the ground. Certainly not to forget about all of the contacts you have, real personal contacts or online social media contacts, to look at subsidiaries or whatnot in the United States. But a lot of actual networking. It took a while to pay off, but what happened is that once you have a small group of clients, the really rewarding thing is to start getting referrals and from those existing clients. And so that's what really helped us get off the ground was a lot of networking. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, John. And we now have a question for Hayes from Joseph. Hayes, in the U.S. market, what is the most effective advertising medium for the B2B market?
The most effective advertising marketing vehicle for the B2B. Once upon a time, I would have said it would be the relevant trade publications that serves that market, and I don't think you can ignore them if there are such things. But increasingly, I believe that I certainly know as a small business myself, I use LinkedIn extensively from a contact standpoint. It's been exceedingly effective for me. I would say any kind of social media approaches that you can use where you can start to establish a presence and a following. Again, I'm thinking in terms of small business. If you're a medium-sized business, then in all likelihood you have the budgets and probably resources you need to hire some support, in which case I would start with figuring out your correct positioning and branding, make sure that's aligned with the U.S. as was discussed earlier. And then I'd probably go for a PR firm first, just because I think getting second and third party endorsements, as you are inclined to do with PR, is the most efficient way to start, especially if it's well targeted and you've made your PR team partners and you're investing properly in it, is the most effective use of marketing dollars in many, many ways, presuming that you've got your website and your social stuff, which is related, under control, because clearly that has to be, if you're directing people to your business, that's where they're going to go. But once that's done, before you get into advertising or doing expensive collateral, I would start with PR and then make sure that you had materials that you could follow up with to respond to anyone who begins to take an interest in your organization.
Thank you so much for that, Hayes. And I'd like to thank all of our wonderful panelists and all of you attending today's webinar, Doing Business in the U.S., Creating U.S.-Ready Marketing Collateral and Unique Selling Proposition. If you have any other questions, please contact us at ukti@altios.us. Once you leave today's webinar, you will receive a survey on the presentation, and we would appreciate if you would complete that and provide your feedback. You will also receive a follow-up email within 24 to 48 hours with a link to view the recording of today's webinar. On behalf of UK Trade and Investment, Altios International, and our presenters, thank you for joining us today, and enjoy the rest of your day.